Schreiner's portrayal of Lyndall won her both feminist acclaim and notoriety, while her use of a fictionalized South African landscape was regarded as pioneering. Nothing is despicable, all is meaningful, nothing is small, all is part of a whole. The Story of an African Farm. Olive Schreiner. L.A. Regenta. Leopolda Alas. Published initially in 2 volumes, La Regenta by Spanish novelist Alas tells the story of a magistrate's wife who, living in a provincial town, seeks fulfillment through religion and adultery. Rich in characters, such as the cathedral's priest and the local Casanova, Alvaro Macia, the novel presents a remarkable picture of provincial life as well as exploring the psychology of the characters, by allowing them to narrate events. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Robert Louis Stevenson. The defining novel that cemented its author's reputation and ensured his celebrity, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson is best known for its remarkable portrayal of what is sometimes described as a split personality. The book initially relates the mystery of 2 men, respectable and sociable Dr. Henry Jekyll and the vice-ridden, brutal murderer Edward Hyde, who appear to be connected in some way. As the story progresses, the reader learns that Jekyll has created a potion to suppress hedonistic aspects of his personality, only to create Hyde, seemingly an evil manifestation of the darkest attributes of his character. Robert Louis Stevenson. When living in Samoa, Robert Louis Stevenson took the nickname Tusitala, or Teller of Tales, a perfect description for the man who wrote some of the world's most famous adventure stories. Born in Edinburgh in 1850, Stevenson decided early in life to make a career in writing, although he agreed to study law to please his father. Dogged by ill health, he was nevertheless a keen adventurer and traveler, visiting the USA and spending time in France where, although bedridden, he wrote some of his best-known work, much of it for children. After leaving Europe for the USA in 1887, in search of more favorable climes to suit his poor health, Stevenson set out with his family in 1888 on a voyage to the South Seas. He settled in Samoa in 1890, where he died 4 years later. Key works: 1881, Treasure Island. 1886, Kidnapped. 1886, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The Mayas. E.C.A. de Quiros. Regarded as the masterwork of one of the greatest European realist novelists, E.C.A. de Quiros, The Mayas is set in fin de siècle Lisbon. Notable for its satire and realism, its central character, Carlos Maya, is a wealthy and talented doctor who is keen to do good work, but lives a dissolute life. Maya embarks on an affair with a beautiful but mysterious woman, but a shocking discovery brings the relationship to an end. E.C.A. de Quiros. Considered Portugal's greatest novelist, E.C.A. de Quiros was also a political activist. Born in northern Portugal in 1845, he studied law, but his real interest was literature, and his short stories and essays soon began appearing in the press. By 1871 he was part of the Generation of 70, a group of rebellious intellectuals who were committed to social and artistic reform. He denounced Portuguese literature as unoriginal. He served as consul in Cuba, England, where he wrote the satirical novels for which he is best known, and Paris, where he died in 1900. Key works: 1876, The Crime of Father Amaro. 1878, Cousin Basilio. 1888, The Mayas. Hunger. Knut Hamsun. Norwegian writer Knut Hamsun was 30 when his first successful novel, Hunger, was published. He had previously spent many impoverished years traveling and working in various jobs, and his novel reflects those experiences. Set in Christiania, it describes the poverty and psychological despair of a young man so bent on success as a writer that he becomes almost demented. The novel's portrayal of obsession and alienation established it as a literary landmark. The Jungle Book. Rudyard Kipling. A collection of stories, linked by poems, The Jungle Book by English writer Kipling is most famous for its tales of Mowgli, an Indian boy raised by wolves and taught the laws of the jungle by Baloo, the brown bear, Bagheera, the panther, and the wolves of the pack. Kipling, who lived in India for many years, used the animals in the tales, which are effectively fables, to present moral lessons about good behavior by contrasting irresponsible humans with animals that follow a strict jungle code. Effi Briest. Theodor Fontane. Considered to be a landmark of Prussian realism, Effi Briest by German writer Fontane tells the story of its 17-year-old protagonist, who is married to Geert von Enstetten, an ambitious nobleman twice her age. Effi has a secret affair with a local womanizer. 6 years later, the affair, long since ended, comes to light and, with the characters bound by a strict Prussian social code so well depicted by Fontane, the story moves towards its tragic end. Jude the Obscure. Thomas Hardy. In his fatalistic Jude the Obscure, English writer Hardy tells the story of Jude Folly, a villager with scholarly ambitions that are never achieved. Married reluctantly and under false pretense, Jude falls in love with his cousin, Sue Bridehead, who then marries a local schoolmaster. Repelled by sex within her marriage, Sue turns to Jude. They live together, but poverty and society's disapproval take a dreadful toll. Critics and readers were so shocked by the novel's sexual frankness and pessimism that Hardy wrote no further novels, turning from fiction to poetry. The Red Badge of Courage. Stephen Crane. One of the great war novels and noted for its realism, terse style, and modern approach, The Red Badge of Courage by U.S. author Crane is set during the U.S. Civil War. The protagonist is Henry Fleming, a young private in the Union Army. He dreams of glory but, when faced with the stark and terrifying reality of fighting on the battlefield, flees from the advancing Confederate forces. Overwhelmed by his shame, he seeks redemption and meaning in a heroic act. Uncle Vanya. Anton Chekhov. A masterly study of aimlessness and hopelessness, Uncle Vanya is thought by many to be Chekhov's finest work. Set on a country estate in turn-of-the-century Russia, the play focuses on estate manager Voynitsky, estate owner Professor Serebryakov and his second wife Yelena and daughter Sonia, and Sonia's unrequited love for local physician Ostrov. Vanya, frustrated by his wasted life and failure to seduce the beautiful Yelena, attempts to shoot Serebryakov but fails. The play ends with nothing having changed. Anton Chekhov. Celebrated as one of the greatest Russian playwrights, Anton Chekhov was born in 1860. He qualified as a doctor and, despite writing prolifically, continued practicing medicine, once describing the latter as his lawful wife and literature as his mistress. Initially, it was short stories that brought him fame. In 1888, he won the Pushkin Prize for his short story The Steppe. From the 1890s he produced the plays for which he is remembered, which were performed at the Moscow Art Theatre. He married actress Olga Nipper in 1901 but died of tuberculosis in 1904. Key works. 1897 The Seagull, 1897 Uncle Vanya, 1904 The Cherry Orchard. The Turn of the Screw. Henry James. A novella by U.S. writer Henry James, The Turn of the Screw is one of the best-known ghost stories ever written. Narrated mainly through the diary of a governess, the story describes her struggle to save her young charges, Flora and Miles, from the demonic clutches of two deceased former servants. Ambiguous in approach, some critics suggested that the governess was hysterical rather than haunted. The story has been influential, paving the way for subsequent tales of innocent children possessed by evil spirits. Whatever I had seen, Miles and Flora saw more, things terrible and unguessable. The Turn of the Screw, Henry James. The Awakening. Kate Chopin. Set in New Orleans, The Awakening by U.S. writer Kate Chopin tells the story of Edna Pontellier and her struggle to break free from the restrictions imposed upon her by both marriage and motherhood. Pontellier seeks her awakening through two sexual affairs, but more importantly through independent thinking, art, music, and swimming. With its explicit portrayal of marital infidelity and female independence, the novel shocked readers and critics, and was censored on its first publication. Today it is regarded as a landmark feminist novel and an early example of Southern literature. Lord Jim. Joseph Conrad. Lord Jim, by Poland-born English novelist Joseph Conrad, describes the efforts of Jim, a young British seaman, to overcome an act of unwitting cowardice that leaves his name tarnished. Helped by a sea captain, Marlowe, who narrates much of the story, Jim becomes a Tuana of Patusan, a fictional South Sea country, and ultimately overcomes his guilt through self-sacrifice. The novel is notable not just for its exploration of idealism and heroism, but also for its sophisticated use of a frame narrative structure. Sister Carrie. Theodore Dreiser. The first novel by U.S. novelist, journalist, and socialist Theodore Dreiser, Sister Carrie concerns the young woman of the title, Carrie, who leaves her home in Wisconsin for Chicago. She gains work in a shoe factory, but after 2 affairs, one with a married man, finally achieves success and wealth in a stage career. Dreiser's publisher, Doubleday, accepted the book but considered the subject matter so shocking in the moralistic climate of fin de siècle USA, that they delayed publication, altering the text and agreeing to only a limited print run. An uncut version did not appear until 1981. Introduction. The dawn of the 20th century was characterized by an almost worldwide feeling of optimism that this was a cultural turning point, a stately progress from the pessimism that typified the end of the 19th century toward a more vibrant, modern era. Industrialization and empire building had brought prosperity, to the Western world at least, and with it the hope of creating a better, fairer society. At the same time, new scientific ideas, such as Sigmund Freud's concept of the unconscious and Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, influenced the way that people thought about themselves and the world. However, the new century turned out to be a turbulent one, as hopes for the future were first shattered by the catastrophic carnage of World War I, and then, after a brief period of hedonistic confidence, dashed by a global economic depression and the rise of Nazism and fascism, which resulted in World War II. Modernism. In the world of literature, the new century was characterized by a move away from gritty realism to distinctly modern forms and genres. Taking their cue from the French symbolists, poets such as Ezra Pound developed a new style that stretched the conventions of verse. In 1922, The Waste Land, by Anglo-American poet T.S. Eliot, captured the disillusionment of the age. Novelists also found a variety of new means of expression. Influenced by existentialist philosophy and the new theories emerging in the field of psychology, Franz Kafka created a fantastic and often nightmarish world of the alienated individual in modern society, while in Japan Natsume Soseki pioneered a similar genre of first-person novel. Another form that was adopted by modernist novelists was the stream of consciousness novel. Although this approach was not a new idea, it was given a particular boost by psychological theories, and it provided Irishman James Joyce with the framework on which he built his modernist style, first in Ulysses and then more experimentally in Finnegan's Wake. Modernism also featured in more conventional prose narratives. German author Thomas Mann, for example, took the Bildungsroman, or formative, rite of passage story, and reshaped it into a modern form, first in the novella Death in Venice, and later in his masterpiece The Magic Mountain. A Warring World. It was not only ideas that shaped the literature of the 20th century, but also events. The Great War of 1914-18 inevitably had a profound effect, which is most obviously seen in the work of poets, such as Wilfred Owen, who served in the forces. However, there was also the lost generation of U.S. writers who had come of age during the war, which included T.S. Eliot, Ernest Hemingway, and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Although writing ostensibly about the heady days of the 1920s, Fitzgerald portrays the world beneath the superficial and ephemeral Roaring Twenties in The Great Gatsby, evoking a mood that anticipates the Great Depression of the coming decade. The 1920s also saw the rise of a generation of African American writers, whose authentic depictions of their lives contrasted with the popular portrayal of the black entertainers of the Jazz Age. In Germany and Austria too, there was a brief period of post-war optimism that was captured vividly by novelists such as Alfred Doblin, but this was as short-lived as elsewhere in Europe and the USA. Hitler's rise to power forced many writers and artists to flee into exile until the end of World War II. The repressive Nazi regime was hostile to degenerate modern art, and so too was the newly formed Soviet Union under Stalin, drawing to a close a century of great Russian writing. In China, the end of 4 millennia of dynastic rule inspired a generation of nationalist writers. The detectives. Popular fiction flourished in the first half of the 20th century, and the detective genre in particular appealed to a mass readership. Pioneered by Victorian writers such as Wilkie Collins in the UK and Edgar Allan Poe in the USA, detective fiction really came into its own with Scotsman Arthur Conan Doyle's creation of Sherlock Holmes. This marked the beginning of a long line of fictional sleuths, as diverse as British writer Agatha Christie's genteel Miss Marple and Hercules Poirot, and the hard-boiled Philip Marlowe, hero of U.S. author Raymond Chandler's dark and tangled noir novels of the 1940s. In context. Focus. Detective fiction comes of age before 1841. U.S. writer Edgar Allan Poe's hero detective in The Murders in the Rue Morgue applies observation, deduction, and intuition to solve a murder. 1852-53 Inspector Bucket investigates a murder in Bleak House, by the English writer Charles Dickens, sifting through a variety of suspects. 1868 English author Wilkie Collins' The Moonstone is published, arguably the first full-length detective novel in English. After 1920 English writer Agatha Christie publishes her first detective novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, marking the start of what is often called a golden age of detective fiction. The sleuth, who uses acute powers of observation and deduction to solve near-impossible puzzles and catch wrongdoers, appears in earlier texts from several cultures. However, detective fiction as a distinct genre emerged only in the 19th century, with the stories of U.S. author Edgar Allan Poe featuring C. Auguste Dupin, and reached its zenith in interwar Britain. At its heart was the detective, cerebral, often at the expense of social skills, usually accompanied by an assistant, and possessed of an ability to identify and decipher clues that baffle the police. Sherlock Holmes, created by Scottish writer Arthur Conan Doyle, epitomized this modern detective. Conan Doyle trained as a doctor in Scotland and pursued his medical career even after writing had brought him acclaim. His true interest was writing historical fiction, but he found far more success with his detective stories, many of which were serialized in the Strand magazine. The Hound of the Baskervilles was the third full-length novel to feature Holmes. Foul play. The story centers on a strange crime on Dartmoor. Sir Charles Baskerville has apparently been terrified to death on his own estate by a ghostly hound. Foul play is suspected, and Holmes investigates. The main story, and a subplot involving an escaped criminal on the moor, are told by Dr. Watson, Holmes's friend and ally and the book's narrator. Like most other works of early detective fiction, The Hound of the Baskervilles features a dastardly crime, a closed group of suspects, an inspired sleuth who arrives to carry out an investigation, and a solution that readers may arrive at themselves through logical deduction. The appeal of the novel lies as much in its plot, the triumph of reason over evil and superstition, as in its eerie, Gothic atmosphere. See also, Bleak House, The Moonstone, The Big Sleep. In context. Focus. I novel. Before 1890 Mori Oge's short story The Dancing Girl, in which a Japanese student in Germany has a doomed relationship, heralds a trend for revelatory autobiographical writing. 1906 in Tosan Shimazaki's The Broken Commandment, a fearful teacher struggles for self-realization as he tries to keep secret the fact he belongs to the outcast social class. After 1907 Tayama Katai's Futon, the confessional tale of his unconsummated passion for a student, is the first overtly factual and autobiographical example of an I novel. 1921, 37 Shiga Naoya's A Dark Night's Passing is an I novel with poetic spirit depicting the inner struggle of a tormented man, in search of serenity. The I novel is a Japanese literary genre that emerged at the beginning of the 20th century. Although called the I novel, the genre has little in common with the Western concept of a novel. It is a form of confessional literature in which the story's contents are usually autobiographical. The genre takes its name from the first-person perspective. Narrators are always sincere. The Western practice of using multiple viewpoints to tell the narrative was considered misleading, because a writer could not tell the objective truth about anyone's perspective but their own. Heartless humans. Natsume Soseki is arguably the greatest writer in modern Japanese history, and his I Am a Cat is a major example of the I novel. The cat narrator's tone is snooty and supercilious, as though he regards himself a nobleman. looking down upon the errant behavior of humans. The autobiographical element of the I-novel comes through the cat's owner who, like all the humans in the book, is mercilessly mocked, and is based upon Soseki himself. It is through the eyes of the cat that Soseki paints his self-portrait. I Am a Cat was first published in installments in the literary magazine Hototajisu, which had mainly showcased haiku verse. Most of the installments can stand on their own as short stories. Living as I do with human beings, the more I observe them, the more I am forced to conclude that they are selfish. I Am a Cat. See also, The Temple of the Golden Pavilion. In context. Focus existentialism. Before 1864 Fyodor Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground is published. It is later celebrated as early existentialist writing. 1880 Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov focuses on the father-son relationship. 1883-85 Contempt for human pity and compassion, a typical existentialist theme, is a major focus in Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. After 1938 Jean-Paul Sartre publishes Nausea, considered a great existentialist novel. 1942 The Outsider by Albert Camus explores people's futile search for meaning in life's disordered events. 1953 Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett depicts the absurd lives of two tramps. The main proposition of existentialism is that anxiety forms the foundation of human feeling and thinking. This condition is triggered when we recognize the absurdity and meaninglessness of our existence. Existentialism has roots in 19th-century Northern European philosophy, with key terms such as angst, or anxiety, coined by Søren Kierkegaard, a Danish thinker whose works influenced Franz Kafka. Confusion and anxiety are represented by an extreme metaphor in Kafka's disturbing story Metamorphosis, and staged in front of a cast of unsympathetic characters. While there are clearly literal discomforts associated with Gregor Samsa's waking form as a verminous, beetling insect, at the core of Kafka's tragic novella is the response of his family and acquaintances to his absurd predicament, as opposed to the impositions of changed physicality. For the first few days especially, there was no conversation that was not about him in one way or another, if only in private. Metamorphosis. Hell is other people. Gregor is rendered utterly dysfunctional and can no longer work as a salesman or support his vulnerable family. Rather than offer compassion, his family appear hugely inconvenienced and disgusted. So Gregor as a beetle is treated as abject and alien, and Kafka deftly exposes the barbaric and inhumane response of the so-called civilized, rational world that they represent. In the words of the existentialist philosopher and writer Jean-Paul Sartre, hell is other people. His phrase perfectly describes Kafka's absurd depiction of a family in crisis. Gregor is reduced to scuttling over the walls and ceiling of his room in the family apartment, or retreating under the sofa, to pass the hours. Although he ultimately abandons any attempt at dignity, and refuses to appeal to his family or assert his inner humanity, he is momentarily moved by his sister's violin playing and lured from his room to listen. With this episode, Gregor briefly refutes his outward beastliness, and attempts to assert his authentic self. But this becomes another opportunity for the family to revile and abuse him, the hostile audience contributing further to his sense of shame and alienation. Surrender to the absurd. Kafka's heroes do not usually conquer angst, instead, they continually seek empirical solutions to outlandish puzzles, often under extraordinary conditions. His longer works, such as The Trial and The Castle, describe unresolved quests, defined by paradox and instability of meaning and interpretation. Metamorphosis, although illogical and nightmarish, is a departure because even the drive to solve the puzzle and finish the quest is abandoned. Gregor experiences a kind of revelation through surrender in the denouement of the novella. Interestingly, Kafka is not known to have declared himself an existentialist, although he acknowledged the influence of Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky, two key figures in existentialism. It was Sartre and Camus who appropriated Kafka into the movement after his death. Franz Kafka. Franz Kafka was the eldest of 6 children of Ashkenazi Jewish parents in Prague. Born in 1883, he was educated in a German elementary school followed by the state gymnasium. He studied law at university in Prague, where he met Max Brod, who posthumously edited and published most of Kafka's works. By 1908 Kafka was working in an insurance company but focusing on his writing. His work was interrupted by ill health and he was diagnosed with tuberculosis in 1917. Kafka's personal life was troubled. His letter to his father portrayed an authoritarian father who alienates his son, and he had a series of unsuccessful relationships with women. In 1923 he moved from Prague to Berlin to live with a lover, but worsening ill health meant a return to his family in Prague, where he died in 1924. Other key works: 1913 The Judgment, 1922 A Hunger Artist, 1925 The Trial, 1926 The Castle, 1966 Letter to his father. See also, The Waste Land, The Trial, The Book of Disquiet, The Outsider, Waiting for Godot. In context. Focus. World War I poets before 1915 Rupert Brooke, a poet of war's noble sacrifice, writes in his sonnet, The Dead, that dying has made us rarer gifts than gold, a sentiment echoed in another sonnet, The Soldier. 1916 While serving in the Foreign Legion, Alan Seeger, that American Rupert Brooke, writes, I have a rendezvous with death, a high-flown, solemn, prophetic poem later admired by President Kennedy. 1916 A sardonic rat, scurries among the dead and the wounded in Isaac Rosenberg's vivid, unrhyming poem, Break of Day in the Trenches. 1917 The archetype of the affable but incompetent leader of men is satirized by Siegfried Sassoon in The General. Poets of many nations wrote of their experiences of combat in World War I. They bore witness to the harrowing events, many of them died young. Among those most admired are the English poets, Siegfried Sassoon, Rupert Brooke, and Wilfred Owen. The Pity of War. Owen worked as a tutor in France before joining the army. At first his work was patriotic, Anthem for Doomed Youth, tells of men who die as cattle, but closes with bugles calling for them from sad shires, a plaintive note of tribute. The slaughter on the Somme, and the influence of Sassoon, toughened up his verse. In Dulce et Decorum Estate, observing blood, gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, Owen knew that a witness to the horror would not repeat to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. The poetry, he said in a draft preface, is in the pity. Some poems focus on the surreal nightmare. In The Show, his soul looks upon the aftermath of battle, where dying men crawl like caterpillars over the ground. In A Strange Meeting, the poet meets, in hell, a loquacious stranger who claims to be the enemy he jabbed and killed. Owen, when he was killed aged 25, was still learning his craft. He is valued for his moral and artistic integrity in powerful poems about man's inhumanity to man. What passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns. Anthem for Doomed Youth. See also, The Waste Land, Catch 22. In context. Focus. Modernist poetry before 1861-65 in Massachusetts, Emily Dickinson privately writes her many masterpieces, short, unconventional poems of religious doubt, anticipating the visionary originality of Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. 1915-62 Ezra Pound's Cantos, a poetic epic, is akin to The Waste Land in its erudite, magpie complexity and direct, unsentimental language. 1915 Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, the monologue of a disillusioned man, is a milestone on the way to full poetic modernism. After 1923 Harmonium, a collection by the U.S. poet Wallace Stevens, brings a vivid yet philosophical imagination to modernism, spinning poems of elusive beauty. Modernist poetry in early 20th century Europe and the USA embodied a feeling that the prevailing poetic ethos, with its firm attachment to romantic subjectivity and traditional forms, was ill-suited to a modern cosmopolitan culture of revolutionized science, technology, and social values. The modernist poets moved away from making personal statements towards a more intellectual objectivity, and gave up any attempt to imagine a pastoral idyll or turn away from the complexities of the city. Rhythmical grumbling. T.S. Eliot described his modernist masterpiece The Waste Land as just a piece of rhythmical grumbling. an American who transformed himself, in London, into an English man of letters. He wrote much of it while recuperating from a breakdown. But contemporaries such as the U.S. poet Ezra Pound saw its pessimism, its fragmented forms, its unmarked quotations in several languages, and its shifting voices as a brilliant reflection of the disorders of the post-war world and its metaphorical barrenness. The critic Clive Bell, brother-in-law of Virginia Woolf, saw the influence of the jazz movement in the poem, calling it a ragtime literature which flouts traditional rhythms. The title of the poem refers to the Arthurian legend of the Fisher King, a king tasked with looking after the Holy Grail, whose impotence affects not just his ability to father children, but the fertility of his entire kingdom, which becomes an arid wasteland. Water and thirst, and death implied within growth, are major themes of Eliot's poem. From its very beginning, even the coming of spring holds no promise. The poem creates the effect of looking through a rapidly turned kaleidoscope of spiritual anxiety. Both lyricism and magnificence feature in the quotations and pastiches, but only as ironic counterpoints to desolation. See also, Les Fleurs du Mal Ulysses, a portrait of the artist as a young man. In context. Focus. Stream of consciousness before 1913, 27 Marcel Proust, in his 7-volume In Search of Lost Time, delves deep into memory and the free-floating associations that help to shape the content of consciousness. 1913, 35 Fernando Pessoa labors on the Book of Disquiet, the existential meanderings of a Lisbon clerk, illuminating fragments of thought and art. After 1927 Into the Lighthouse Virginia Woolf moves back and forth between narrative omniscience and stream of consciousness. 1929 William Faulkner uses stream of consciousness in The Sound and the Fury, entering the minds of 3 very different brothers. Literary critic and poet Ezra Pound declared 1922 to be the start of a new era, asserting that the old one had ended when James Joyce wrote the last words of his novel Ulysses. The year that changed everything was bookended by the publication of Ulysses and of T.S. Eliot's poem The Waste Land, 2 towering achievements of modernist literature. Exploding the genres of realist fiction and poetry, both works mined out of the depths of their authors' astonishing originality and serious artistic and moral purpose, a new kind of literary ore. In the bleak years after World War I, Joyce, Eliot, and other writers set about forming a new culture out of the fragmented remains of the old. Literature would never be the same again. Dislike that job. House of Mourning. Walk Pat. Doesn't hear. Deaf beetle he is. Ulysses. Stream of consciousness. One approach modernist writers adopted to disrupt narrative realism was stream of consciousness. In fiction, stream of consciousness is a representation of the flow of a character's thoughts, perceptions, and feelings. While long passages of introspection can be found in much earlier works such as the epistolary novel Pamela by Samuel Richardson, fiction at the turn of the 20th century went further. Henry James and Marcel Proust moved towards greater subjectivity of viewpoint, in terms of both subject matter and its formal treatment. The first full-blown use of interior monologue in fiction is thought to have been in a short novel, Les Lauriers sans Coupes, by Edouard Dujardin, published in 1887. Joyce famously picked up a copy of this book at a Paris railway station kiosk in 1903. The style has been linked with the rise of psychology as a science, and indeed the phrase, stream of consciousness, was coined by the philosopher and psychologist William James. In The Principles of Psychology, the term was first applied in a literary context to an early stream of consciousness novel in English, Dorothy Richardson's Pointed Roofs, which used the technique to explore the idea of a feminine prose. With Ulysses, the most famous and influential example of stream of consciousness writing, Joyce made the sustained literary leap out of traditional narrative techniques into conveying the mind of the character directly, unmediated by the author. Virginia Woolf, too, began experimenting with stream of consciousness soon after, notably in Mrs. Dalloway. To register the complexity and subtlety of the interior mental process, from conscious to almost unconscious thought, these writers followed loose, often metaphorical, associations of words and phrases, as well as inserting ungrammatical constructions and omitting definite or indefinite articles. Joyce abandoned complete coherence for the realism of the interior monologue, although the flow of thoughts may indirectly evoke action. Postal order stamp. Post office lower down. Walk now suggests that Leopold Bloom, walking through the city in Ulysses, is reminding himself of what he needs to buy and where to buy it. Ulysses takes place on a single day, June 16, 1904, in Dublin, in the course of which its three protagonists cross paths with each other and a variety of other characters, the city. Every life is many days, day after day. We walk through ourselves, meeting robbers, ghosts, giants, old men, young men, wives, widows, brothers in love. Ulysses. A June day in Dublin. The entire action of Ulysses takes place in and around Dublin on June 16, 1904, as three main characters cross paths: Stephen Dedalus, a teacher and would-be writer, aged 22, Leopold Bloom, an advertising canvasser, half Hungarian Jewish and half Irish, aged 38, and his wife Molly, a singer, aged 34, whom Leopold rightly suspects of having an affair with a man about town known as Blazes of Boylan. The novel teams with other characters, too, and a kaleidoscopic portrait of Dublin emerges out of the inner lives of Stephen, Bloom, and Molly, in 250,000 words of microscopically detailed invention. The principal settings are a habitable defensive tower, a school, a beach, a house, a butcher's shop, a graveyard, a newspaper office, a library, a funeral parlor, a concert room, a tavern, a hospital, a brothel, and a cabman's shelter, as well as Dublin's city streets. Laying bare the multiplicity of thoughts, emotions and actions that take Stephen, Bloom, and Molly through their day and night, Ulysses makes the private public on a scale never before undertaken in fiction. The opening chapters form a bridge with Joyce's earlier, autobiographical novel, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which is the story of Stephen Dedalus gaining the confidence to liberate his talents from the conformist pressures of the Catholic Church, his upbringing, and country. In Ulysses, Stephen is first shown in the morning, verbally jousting with cynical quasi-friend Buck Mulligan, in the tower where they live on Sandy Cove. He thinks back to his mother on her deathbed and guiltily reflects on his refusal, on atheistic principle, to pray for her. He then teaches a history lesson and walks on the beach. The novel then shifts back in time to 8 a.m. and enters full stream of consciousness mode as the reader follows Leopold Bloom planning breakfast at home, shopping at the butcher's, and then cooking the meal and taking a tray upstairs to Molly. Joyce uses stream of consciousness to varying degrees to relate the experiences of Stephen, Bloom, and Molly, although to move the action forward in any particular passage, he skillfully interweaves stream of consciousness and third-person narrative. Bloom and the real world. Naturalism, or scientific realism, had become the lifeblood of the novel in mid-19th century France, especially in the fiction of Émile Zola, who presented life's seamier aspects in meticulous detail. Later French writers such as Henri Barbusse, in Under Fire, deployed brutal realism to describe the appalling horrors of World War I. Ulysses, which Joyce began writing in 1915, belongs to this tradition of novelistic candor, although Joyce's spiritual ancestor was less Zola, whose naturalism was pessimistic and didactic. Then Zola's 16th-century compatriot François Rabelais, a writer whose broad comedy and fascination with the excesses of the Carnival Ulysses parallels in certain sections. Leopold Bloom is one of the most fully realized characters in all fiction. He is what the French call un moyen sensual, an average man with the usual appetites, intelligent but far from intellectual. He has a genial character and shows a liking for comfort and a desire to avoid confrontation. When he is first introduced, the easy relationship he enjoys with his own bodily functions and with at least some people within his social milieu sets him apart from the cerebral, spiky Stephen, whose monologue on the beach in the third episode begins, ineluctable modality of the visible, at least that if no more. Compare the first sentence of Bloom's stream of consciousness, another slice of bread and butter, 3, 4, right. She didn't like her plate full. The Martello Tower with its gloomy, domed living room is where Stephen Dedalus pursues a writer's life with a stately, plump Buck Mulligan and ponderous Saxon Haynes. Panoply of styles. As the novel progresses, many other prose styles interweave with stream of consciousness and naturalism. Episode 13, for instance, parodies sentimental women's fiction, beginning with the words, "The summer evening had begun to fold the world in its mysterious embrace." Bloom, relaxing at dusk on the beach, masturbates at the sight of a young woman, knowingly revealing her legs. The narrative's formulaic, rose-tinted romanticism provides an ironic counterpoint to his seedy voyeurism. In the following episode, when Bloom visits a maternity hospital, Joyce uses a sequence of different literary styles, a pastiche of English literature that draws on Anglo-Saxon, Chaucer, Samuel Pepys, and Thomas de Quincey. For some readers, this is Joyce at his most alienatingly erudite. Episode 15 is a phantasmagorical play set in Dublin's red light district, Night Town, where Bloom's repressed masochistic fantasies and Stephen's guilt over his mother are reflected in vivid, dreamlike tableaus. In its dissolution of space and time and its rapid succession of hallucinations, for example, Bloom giving birth to 8 male yellow and white children, and the poet Tennyson appearing in a Union Jack blazer and cricket flannels, the fantasy is deeply unsettling. In a nightmarish scene, Bloom acts as Stephen's protector when he is gripped by a petrifying hallucination at a brothel. In part, Joyce was inspired by Dada, a surrealist movement that rejected reason and logic, which the young artists of the Cabaret Voltaire founded in Zurich in 1916. The influence is particularly evident in this episode. Like the Dadaists, Joyce set out to shock the public with a deliberate offensive against conventional standards of taste and propriety. There follows an episode that takes the form of a catechism, an extended question-and-answer dialogue, that is used to convey an account of Bloom and Stephen repairing together to Bloom's house for cocoa. It is here that Bloom and Stephen come closest to empathy. The analytical, exhaustively cataloging manner in which events are related acts as a counterpoint to the subtle affinity the two feel towards each other. I'd have to get a nice pair of red slippers like those Turks with the fez used to sell, or yellow, and a nice semi-transparent morning gown that I badly want like the one long ago in Walpole's only 8.6 or 18.6. Ulysses. Molly Bloom's soliloquy. The final chapter of Ulysses is a masterpiece of stream-of-consciousness writing. It reveals the intimate thoughts of Molly Bloom in the night, lying in bed on the verge of sleep. Until this point, Molly has been seen through the eyes of her jealous husband, Leopold. The shift in viewpoint, to the feminine, is one of the most brilliant in modern literature. Having depicted the city's patriarchal culture, in which women play an indispensable role as wives, mothers, and prostitutes, sources of emotional nourishment and physical satisfaction, without their voices being heard, Joyce now restores the balance by giving Molly her own voice. Allowing his female protagonist to have the last word is a testament to Joyce's all-inclusive imagination. However, some feminist critics see Molly, in her passivity, as a creature of male misconceptions. As Molly lies in bed, away from all stimuli, the interior monologue can attain its purest form, without narrative interruptions. Punctuation is abandoned. Recollections jostle together. Frank language, with earthy colloquialisms, gives way to a memory of her youth. In Gibraltar and her later passionate courtship by Bloom, expressed in the style of romantic fiction. This style is not purely a literary device, but part of the inner language of Molly's romantic, though fleshly, sensibility. Listen, a four-worded wave speech, Sisu, HRSS, Orseus, Us. Ulysses. Myth and modernity. Linguistic experimentation is not the only literary technique that underpins this multi-layered book. The title, Ulysses, is the clue to an elaborate symbolic substructure. Ulysses is the Latin-derived name for Odysseus, the Greek king of Ithaca, who, in Homer's epic The Odyssey, spends 10 years after the Trojan War as a wandering adventurer, before returning home. Joyce identifies Leopold Bloom with Odysseus, and equates Stephen with the king's son, Telemachus, who in the first 4 books of the Odyssey searches in vain for his lost father. He associates Molly with Penelope, Odysseus's wife, who believes that her husband is still alive and will return to her. Each of the 18 episodes of the novel corresponds with an adventure from Homer's epic. The first 3 episodes focus on Stephen, and follow a structure that echoes the Odyssey. In the 3rd episode, Stephen questions the institution of fatherhood while thinking about a discussion in a library. The passage translates Telemachus's predicament as a son without a father into an abstract debate on modern notions of the father-son relationship. In episode 12, the Cyclops, a one-eyed giant from whom Odysseus escapes in the Odyssey, takes the form of an aggressively xenophobic patriot who argues vociferously with Bloom. The narrow chauvinism of the citizen mirrors the Cyclops' limited vision. Later, the unnamed narrator tells of a chimney sweep who near drove his gear into my eye. The thematic value of the Homeric parallels is strongest in the mythic roles given to Stephen and Bloom. Stephen is unconsciously seeking a supportive father figure, so he can become a father himself, both of children and of art. Passages on the Holy Trinity, which contains the most complex of all father-son relationships, and on Shakespeare's Hamlet, torn apart by vengeful thoughts about his father's murderer, who is now his own stepfather, add layers of meaning to Stephen's quest. Conversely, Bloom has a deep psychic need for a son. This adds poignancy to the Odysseus-Telemachus dynamic. Bloom and Stephen, after several near misses, encounter each other by chance at the Hollis Street Maternity Hospital. The associations of the place with birth and parenthood are no accident. Bloom in due course saves Stephen from getting arrested after a fracas in Dublin's red light area. When, later that night, they sit drinking cocoa together in Bloom's kitchen, Stephen glimpses the past in Bloom, while Bloom sees the future in Stephen. It is typical of Joyce's fictional subtlety that this mutual recognition is a fleeting suggestion rather than an obvious climax. Joyce's Homeric framework, as well as providing a set of symbolic correspondences, also allowed him to imply that Bloom, the ordinary man and good citizen, could be credited with a heroic dimension. This is the heroism, or anti-heroism, of the everyday, conducted largely within the mind, the arena of an individual's fears and longings. It is here that he combats jealousy, anger, boredom, shame and guilt, and cherishes the hope and love that give life its meaning. In Odysseus and Circe by Bartholomew Spranger, the witch goddess uses her powers to seduce the hero, paralleled by Bella Cohen's teasing of Bloom in Ulysses. He heard then a warm heavy sigh, softer, as she turned over and the loose brass quoits of the bedstead jingled. Ulysses. Exile and belonging. After the closing paragraph of the novel, Joyce left a reminder of his own Odyssean journey as its writer, Trieste, Zurich, Paris, 1914-1921. While aware of himself as an artist operating in a cosmopolitan milieu, he also felt the tug of exile. Living abroad made it possible for him to recreate Dublin in all its vulgarity and vibrancy as the home of his imagination. Back in 1904, when the book is set, political feelings were running high, after the failure of Home Rule, an attempt to make Ireland self-governing. In the year of Ulysses' publication, after a bloody civil war, the Irish Free State was formed. Reflecting these political realities, the characters of Joyce's fictional Dublin are full of anxieties about their relationship with institutions, Irish nationalism, the British Empire, the Catholic Church, and the Irish literary revival. While Ulysses presents the details of individual experience with unprecedented frankness, it is also unflinching in its portrayal of a restless microcosm of Irish society. However, all themes in Ulysses are subordinate to the living richness of its fictional world. The vitality of the novel comes from the life invested in it, which fights back against the book's elaborate literary artifices. At the core of this, the most self-consciously artful novel since the playful experiments of Laurence Sterne's Tristram Shandy in the mid-18th century, are the lives and loves of Dubliners, realized with amazing verisimilitude. James Joyce. Born in a suburb of Dublin, Ireland, in 1882, James Joyce was brought up in poverty after his father lost his job as a tax collector. Joyce read English, French, and Italian at University College Dublin, then moved to Paris, intending to study medicine. He returned to Dublin after his mother died, scraping a living reviewing and teaching. Joyce eloped with Nora Barnacle in 1904, and the couple moved to Zurich. Later, he got a teaching job in Trieste. His book of short stories, Dubliners, was published in 1914, the year before he began writing Ulysses. When sections of this novel appeared in the U.S. journal The Little Review, the magazine was put on trial for obscenity. In 1920, Joyce moved to Paris, where he lived for 20 years. Here he wrote his dreamlike late masterpiece, Finnegan's Wake. In 1940, Joyce fled the Nazi invasion and went to Zurich, where he died in 1941. Other key works: 1914 Dubliners, 1916 A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, 1939 Finnegan's Wake. See also, Odyssey, The Waste Land in Search of Lost Time, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, Mrs. Dalloway, The Sound and the Fury, The Book of Disquiet. In context. Focus. Baihua literature before 1917. Huscher publishes a preliminary discussion of literature reform in New Youth magazine, calling for a new approach to literature that does not rely on old forms. 1918. Lu Xun publishes Diary of a Madman, considered the first modern Chinese story. 1921-22. Lu Xun's The True Story of A6 is serialized in Beijing Morning News. After 1931-32, Turbulent Stream, by Ba Jin, is published in serial form, later appearing as a single volume, The Family. A novel about the clash of old and new ways, it was hugely popular with Chinese youth. 1935. Lu Xun publishes Old Tales Retold, recasting popular Chinese myths. The Baihua literary and cultural movement in China, initiated in 1917 by the scholar and intellectual Huscher, went hand in hand with the May 4th movement, a political and cultural crusade that grew out of a student uprising in Beijing in 1919 and spearheaded a new sense of Chinese nationalism. Followers of the movement rejected traditional beliefs and promoted a shift towards Western ideas of democracy and modern science. They also encouraged a move away from writing in classical Chinese and towards the use of a Baihua, a written vernacular language that was understood by everyone. Baihua language was soon used in Chinese newspapers and textbooks, revolutionizing the education of the peasantry. New ways of thinking. Lu Xun was the first modern author to write in the vernacular script. His work was championed by the Communist Party, which he supported, though he never became a member. Call to Arms is Lu Xun's first collection of writing, and brings together his two earliest and most famous stories, Diary of a Madman and The True Story of A6. An ironic attack on traditional culture, Diary of a Madman tells of a villager, the madman, who believes that his friends and family are practicing cannibalism, and also becomes convinced that the classic Confucian texts contain encouragement of the practice. The True Story of A6 is a novella about an ignorant and deluded peasant who considers himself to be wise, and shows the backwardness and complacency of the old generation. Both these stories mark the beginning of Baihua literature, embodying it not only in their use of vernacular language but also in addressing concerns of the May 4th movement, such as the outdated strictures of Confucian thought and the unthinking acceptance of rusty traditions. See also, Quan Tangshi. In context. Focus. Modern Arabic voices after 1935. Prolific writer and scholar Taha Hussein, the Dean of Arabic Literature, tells of an Egyptian author's struggle between Arab and European culture in his novel A Man of Letters, played out between Cairo and Paris during World War I. 1956. 57. Nahib Mahfouz's The Cairo Trilogy follows a Cairanais family from the 1919 Egyptian Revolution against British colonial rule to near the end of World War II in 1944, highlighting the personal, social, and political struggle of a changing city and country. 1985. The Sand Child, written in French by Tahar Ben Jelaun, explores and critiques issues of traditional Islamic values, gender politics, and the construction of identity in a post-colonial Moroccan setting. Colonial empires began their inevitable decline in the aftermath of World War I, thanks partly to the war's impact on the centers of Western culture. Literary orientations, topics, and themes began to reflect the new shift in the balance between colonizers and colonized. Among the many post-colonial narratives to emerge, those emanating from the Arab world of North African and Middle Eastern countries came to international prominence. Diversity of ideas. Lebanese writer, philosopher, and artist Khalil Gibran was one of the most acclaimed authors to emerge out of the blossoming pool of Arab intellectuals. His own Christian upbringing and his interest in the teachings of Islam, Sufism, and Judaism represented a break from the traditional link between geographical and spiritual beliefs, and were the major influences on his English collection of illustrated prose poems entitled The Prophet. In this book, Gibran uses a style familiar in religious scripture and sermons to deliver short speeches spoken by the Prophet al-Mustafa to a diverse crowd as he is about to depart by boat from the city of Orphalese. The 26 essays range from reflections on love, passion, children, and eating, to thoughts on justice, time, evil, and death. The essays emphasize human relationships and encompass themes of diversity and a universal love that is free from the bounds of a single belief system. These things move within you as lights and shadows in pairs that cling. The Prophet. See also 1001 Nights. In context. Focus Bildungsroman. Before 1795-96 Johann Wolfgang von Goethe publishes Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship, often called the first Bildungsroman. 1798 German author Ludwig Tieck publishes Franz Sternbald's Wanderings, a romantic novel with hallmarks of the Bildungsroman. 1849-50 Charles Dickens' partly autobiographical book David Copperfield is published. 1855 Swiss author Gottfried Keller publishes Green Henry, a crucial Bildungsroman, and also partly autobiographical. 1916 A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, by James Joyce, shows that the Bildungsroman has a place in modernist literature. Widely considered to be Thomas Mann's masterpiece, The Magic Mountain has many claims to greatness. It is regarded as one of the best German novels of all time, one of the finest works of the 20th century, a sublime dark comedy and rumination on death and disease, and a key work of modernism. It is also a fine example of a Bildungsroman, a genre that had its roots in 18th century Germany, and is still going strong today. Although earlier examples are sometimes cited, many studies place the birth of the genre at the publication of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's novel Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship in 1795-96. It contains all of the key ingredients, being the story of a young artist's formation, or Bildung, his struggle to find expression and happiness, and his eventual acceptance of his place in society. Over the succeeding decades and then centuries, many other great writers felt a desire to tell a story roughly similar to their own. In France, Gustave Flaubert published A Sentimental Education. In England, Charles Dickens wrote David Copperfield, and the Irish writer James Joyce offered a portrait of the artist as a young man. The genre's influence spread across Europe and then the world. The Magic Mountain, on which the Berghof is located, is a symbol of the sanatorium's metaphorical distance from the rest of the world, a secluded place where even time flows differently. Inspired by sickness. The Magic Mountain had its beginnings in Thomas Mann's visit to a high-altitude sanatorium in Davos, Switzerland, in 1912, where his wife was recovering from a lung infection. It was at first intended to be a slim volume to accompany the novella Death in Venice, which he had published that year. However, it expanded in the telling, as, with the outbreak of World War I in 1914, Mann became very aware that the world he was describing was coming to a sudden and violent end. His views on both nationalism and bourgeois society were greatly changed by the conflict, in which he saw the values of so-called civilization driving society blindly towards mass death and destruction. The novel had thus taken on greater significance, and continued to grow in size. After the war, Mann revised the text for many years, eventually publishing the novel in 1924, when it was hailed as a masterpiece. The Magic Mountain tells the story of a young man called Hans Castorp, who goes to the Swiss Alps to visit his cousin Joachim in a sanatorium called the Berghof. Hans has good prospects, and is about to take up a job in the shipbuilding industry. With its clear air, spectacular surroundings, few visitors, and quiet, peaceful atmosphere, the hospital exists in its own small, enclosed world. Once he is there, Castorp himself begins to display symptoms of tuberculosis, and is persuaded to stay until he has recovered. He ends up remaining in the sanatorium for 7 years. The plot of the novel revolves around the various patients whom he meets, and the relationships that he develops with them. All interest in disease and death is only really another expression of interest in life. The Magic Mountain. An Education in Life. It is from the other patients in the sanatorium that Hans Castorp receives the education, in art, politics, love, and the human condition, that all Bildungsroman heroes must gain. Mann uses the characters as representatives of the different ideas and belief systems of pre-World War I Europe. We meet Leo Nafta, a Jew-turned-Marxist Jesuit, Ludovico Settembrini, an Italian secular humanist, and Meneer Peperkorn, a hedonistic Dutchman with a tropical disease. Each of these characters attempts to sway Castorp towards his own way of thinking, meaning that a great part of the book is taken up with philosophical debates. There is a woman, too, called Claudia Chauchat, with whom Castorp falls in love, thereby receiving his necessary education in romance and erotic temptation. Where most Bildungsromans involve a physical as well as an emotional journey, the Magic Mountain makes a point of staying geographically in one place, the Berghof, and the journey it offers is through Western ideologies. It is almost as if the height of the mountain itself provides the young Castorp with a view across all of Europe at this crucial juncture. The book serves as both a major example of a Bildungsroman and a parody of the genre. The essential elements of the Bildungsroman are all present: a young, impressionable hero who is setting out in life, an education process that is often difficult, but which he comes through in one piece, and at last, a venturing forth. Castorp must go through the experience of sickness and recovery to arrive at a true appreciation of life. Therefore, the book unquestionably belongs to the genre. Yet Mann parodies or challenges it on almost every level. I, for one, have never come across a perfectly healthy human being. The Magic Mountain. Layers of parody. On one level, there are the various lessons that Castorp receives. Different characters offer views of the world that contradict each other, and it is not clear whether Mann approves of any of them. In earlier Bildungsromans, the lessons learned and the values gained by the central character are intended to be approved of, or agreed with, by the reader. So, for example, David Copperfield in Dickens' novel might learn not to take people at face value. The Magic Mountain rejects this formula. As a modern novel, it is aware that there are many ways of looking at the world, and none of them is necessarily the right one. Considering this as Mann's viewpoint, the whole purpose of the book as a novel of education is revealed to be parody. Deep down, the Bildungsroman genre had always been an earnest enterprise, and it is this that Mann is poking fun at. For example, the narrator maintains an aloof attitude towards Castorp himself, thereby reminding the reader that he is a mediocre young man. And whereas the Bildungsroman hero should be fully formed by the end of the book, in fact Castorp emerges with no real sense that he has learned anything from the lessons in life and philosophy he has received over the course of 7 years. It is love, not reason, that is stronger than death. The Magic Mountain. Adrift in time. Mann undercuts the purpose of the Bildungsroman in other ways, in particular as regards the theme of time and its relation to narrative progression. The passage of time is a crucial matter to those who are sick and dying, and yet in the hermetically sealed environment of the sanatorium, time is something that is very hard to keep track of. The patients calculate the amount of time that has passed only in units of 1 month. Any past event, however long ago, is said to have happened just the other day, a habit Castorp himself eventually adopts. It is important to our idea of a Bildungsroman that an education should be an ongoing process, a story told in sequence. Yet Mann deprives Castorp of this structure, or perspective on events. Incidents are loose in time, and we cannot pin them down. Each successive chapter covers an increasing amount of time, from 1 day to 6 years. The Magic Mountain is thus deeply disparaging towards its own genre. It contains all the contents of a Bildungsroman while showing them to be a sham, or that their benefits are at best impossible to calculate. It is not surprising, then, that the book has inspired relatively few imitators. It is too much like the last word in the genre, and perhaps too grand and brilliant in scope and sweep, for anyone to want to follow in its footsteps. Writers have nonetheless continued to find new uses for the genre, exploring themes that range from postcolonialism and modern history to sensual and sensory awakenings. Chronically ill patients at high-altitude sanatoria in the Swiss Alps lived in a rarefied atmosphere, with events in the world, down there, barely impinging on their lives. Thomas Mann. Thomas Mann was born to a wealthy family in Lübeck, northern Germany, in 1875. He first came to attention with his early masterpiece Buddenbrooks, published when he was just 26, a novel about the decline of a wealthy family much like Mann's own. In 1905, he married Katja Pringsheim, the daughter of a wealthy Jewish industrialist. They had 6 children, 3 of whom became writers. In 1929, Mann was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. In 1933, Mann left Germany for Switzerland, and on the eve of World War II he moved to the USA, where he taught at Princeton University before settling in California and becoming an American citizen. During the war he made a number of anti-Nazi speeches recorded in the USA and broadcast from Britain to Germany. After the war he returned to Europe. He died in Switzerland in 1955, aged 80. Other key works. 1901 Buddenbrooks, 1912 Death in Venice. 1933, 43 Joseph and His Brothers. 1947 Dr. Faustus. See also, Jane Eyre David Copperfield Little Women A Sentimental Education Death in Venice A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, To Kill a Mockingbird Midnight's Children. In context. Focus. The Lost Generation Before. 1920 F. Scott Fitzgerald's short story, Bernice Bobs Her Hair, looks at the tension between traditional feminine values and the liberation of the Jazz Age, themes the author revives in The Great Gatsby. 1922 T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land prefigures lost generation writing in its exploration of the disintegration of culture, including empty sex and loss of spiritual meaning. After. 1926 Ernest Hemingway, In the Sun Also Rises, delves into the themes of love, death, and masculinity. 1930. 36 John Dos Passos explores the American dream with the stories of 12 characters in his USA trilogy. The author and literary hostess Gertrude Stein, talking with Ernest Hemingway, spoke of a lost generation of the young, those who had served in World War I. Hemingway claimed that Stein first heard the words from a garage owner who had serviced her car, an anecdotal detail that resonates suggestively with the garage scenes in The Great Gatsby. Lost in this context means disoriented or alienated, as opposed to disappeared. After Hemingway's use of it in the epigraph to his novel The Sun Also Rises, the phrase, lost generation, came to refer to a group of young American expatriate writers in the creative melting pot of Paris in the 1920s, which included F. Scott Fitzgerald, John Dos Passos, Ezra Pound, and Hemingway himself. World War I had left its mark, and they were restless and cynical, searching for meaningful experience in love, writing, drink, and hedonism. Fitzgerald, one of the lost generation's most important writers, found himself seduced by the scintillating surfaces of the jazz age of the 1920s, while at the same time being keenly aware of its defective moral values and the emptiness of its promise of a better life for all. His most famous novel, The Great Gatsby, tells a personal story of Gatsby's doomed dream of love. However, at the same time it is a story about the doomed American dream, its promise of a better world revealed as a sham. "Can't repeat the past?" he cried incredulously. "Why, of course you can. The Great Gatsby. New money, new values." Fitzgerald saw the Jazz Age as an era of miracle and excess. A new post-war prosperity was centered on Wall Street, where huge fortunes were made trading in stocks and bonds. The ideal of the self-made man was an attractive antidote to the power of old money passed on by inheritance and marriage among the best families. The 1920s in the USA seemed to offer a new social mobility, healing class wounds and challenging snobbery. Those who had sought their fortunes in the West now came east again, to make their fortunes and to spend their wealth on magnificent homes, fine things, and high living. Such was the dream, anyway. But the reality was that wealth for some led to the impoverishment of others, and at the same time gave rise to a culture of surface glitter that was morally and spiritually empty at its core. Fakery of all kinds abounded and snobbery still existed, it had just found new targets. After the passing of the 18th Amendment in 1919, which prohibited the sale of alcohol, many entrepreneurs channeled their talents into bootlegging, the smuggling of illegal liquor, much of it sold in speakeasies. Racism was rife too. In the first chapter of The Great Gatsby, Tom Buchanan expresses the supremacist view that, if we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. Radiance and rottenness. Fitzgerald saw his novel as a purely creative work, not trashy imaginings as in my stories, but the sustained imagination of a sincere and yet radiant world. That radiance, reflected in a sensuous prose style suffused with a romantic glow, is seen in the dazzling glamour of fashionable East Coast society that Fitzgerald takes for his subject. Jay Gatsby owns a colossal mansion, in the style of a French Hotel de Ville, in West Egg, on the shore of Long Island, outside New York. Gatsby is an enigma, an incomer from the Midwest around whom many rumors circulate, that he has killed a man, that his claim to an Oxford education is a lie, that he made his money bootlegging. Every Saturday he throws decadent parties, with hundreds of guests, as described by the novel's narrator, Nick Carraway, who rents a small house next door. There is hilarity and jazz in these revels, but also a great deal of drunkenness and falling out, especially between couples. Indeed, men and women speak to each other throughout the book in dialogue that is flippant and insincere. Nick gets to know Gatsby and learns his secret, that for 5 years he has been obsessively in love with the beautiful socialite Daisy Buchanan, who happens to be Nick's cousin, and who is now married to Tom, a wealthy college friend of Nick's. Daisy is the reason Gatsby bought his mansion on the opposite shore from the Georgian colonial house she shares with Tom. All Gatsby's wealth, acquired from shady business dealings with a mafioso-style crook called Meyer Wolfsheim, is paraded with the sole intention of winning back his lost love, now that he finally has the capital to support her. Gatsby's wild, opulent parties, depicted in this 1949 film adaptation of the book, brought together the old-moneyed socialites from East Egg and their brash West Egg neighbors. The importance of place. The novel's themes are mapped out in its highly symbolic topography. East Egg, home to Daisy and Tom as well as most of Gatsby's party guests, stands for traditional values and old money. West Egg, where Gatsby lives, for fashionable affluence, the nouveau riche. A short distance away is New York, teeming with dubious deals and clandestine pleasures. In between lies a patch of terrain where the bleakness underlying the glamour is depressingly apparent, the Valley of Ashes. This desolate region recalls T.S. Eliot's modernist poem The Waste Land, whose title refers to the ancient myth of a kingdom blighted by a curse. It is here that Tom's mistress, Myrtle Wilson, lives with her sad, passive, garage-owning husband, near a giant billboard advertising an optician's business. The spectacles on the sign are ironic, as nobody is clear-sighted in Gatsby's world, not even Nick, who thinks of himself as inclined to reserve all judgments, but in fact feels superior to everyone, including his cynical girlfriend, a professional golfer named Jordan Baker. I was within and without, simultaneously enchanted and repelled by the inexhaustible variety of life.
The Great Gatsby. Color and time. Jordan and Daisy are first seen in white dresses, but neither is as innocent as this choice of color might suggest. Color in The Great Gatsby is symbolic of the book's themes. Gatsby wears a pink suit and drives a yellow Rolls-Royce, hues denoting his desperate need to make an impression. One of the book's most prevalent symbols is green, the color of the light at the end of Daisy's mooring dock, which Gatsby gazes at yearningly from across the water. In the final pages, alone in Gatsby's empty garden, Nick has a vision of the fresh, green breast of the New World, glimpsed by the first settlers to reach Long Island. He then muses on Gatsby's belief in that symbolic green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It is here, in the green light and the green land, that the novel's concerns with individual and national destiny converge. At the end of the book, feeling that the East is haunted after the book's final tragedy and distorted beyond my eyes' powers of correction, Nick returns to his Midwestern home. In his shifting, worldly, highly nuanced perceptions and sympathies, Nick is as much the novel's subject as Gatsby. The thought he leaves us with is that the past pulls us back irresistibly. Dreams of progress are fool's gold. Belated acclaim. When he was planning his novel in 1923, Fitzgerald wrote that he wanted to produce something extraordinary and beautiful and simple and intricately patterned. He achieved this ambition with panache, but the book initially received mixed reviews and sold poorly. By the time of his death, Fitzgerald thought of himself as a failure. During the last year of his life, only 72 copies of his 9 books were recorded as sales in his royalty statements. Nowadays, The Great Gatsby and Fitzgerald's subsequent work, Tender is the Night, are widely regarded as among the greatest U.S. novels ever written. Tender is the Night follows a narrative that fictionalizes strands in Fitzgerald's deeply troubled life, including adultery, mental illness, and an acute sense of personal and creative failure. The Great Gatsby is the more acclaimed of the 2 novels. It is particularly admired for its forensic exposure of a flawed milieu. Its finely judged prose, combining first-person informality with superbly cadenced description. Its brilliantly telling dialogue, capable of revealing a moral vacuum in the briefest of exchanges. And its structural accomplishment, for example, in the placing of Jordan's account of Gatsby's backstory, which is both a flashback and a flash-forward. Like the rest of the Lost Generation, Fitzgerald may have been reacting to the mood of his times, disillusionment, a loss of moral bearings, and the focus on the material rather than the spiritual, but his novel transcends the moment of its creation. This is in part because of its continuing relevance in today's climate of celebrity, corporate greed, and a world economy driven by inflated asset prices. But the book is also timelessly important because every aspect of it, aesthetically, bears witness to Fitzgerald's unassailable mastery of his art. The characters in the novel are fleshed out by the book's narrator, Nick Carraway, who has come to New York to seek his fortune. He befriends Gatsby, who is in love with Nick's beautiful cousin, Daisy, who is in turn married to the boorish Tom Buchanan. So we beat on boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. The Great Gatsby. F. Scott Fitzgerald. Francis Scott Fitzgerald was born in 1896 in St. Paul, Minnesota, USA. In 1917 he dropped out of Princeton University to join the Army. He fell in love with Zelda Sayre, the daughter of a judge, marrying her after his first novel, This Side of Paradise, brought him success, at the age of 24. He supported the family by writing stories for popular magazines. His second novel, The Beautiful and Damned, confirmed his reputation as chief chronicler and critic of the Jazz Age. In 1924 he moved with Zelda to the French Riviera to write The Great Gatsby. The couple later shuttled between France and the USA. Fitzgerald had a troubled relationship with alcohol. After Tender is the Night came out in 1934, he struggled for 2 years with drink and depression. In 1937 he tried his hand at writing for Hollywood, and died of a heart attack there in 1940, aged 44. Other key works. 1922 The Beautiful and Damned, 1922 Tales of the Jazz Age. 1934 Tender is the Night. See also, The Wasteland of Mice and Men, The Grapes of Wrath, The Outsider. In context. Focus. Weimar-era experimentalism before 1915 Metamorphosis, a key early anteriorlistic text by Franz Kafka, influences several other modern German-language writers. After 1931, 32 Austrian author Hermann Brock's trilogy The Sleepwalkers experiments with form, changing genre according to the plot. 1930, 43 Austrian Robert Musil's novel The Man Without Qualities is structured as a tour of ideas through which the central character attempts to define himself. 1943 Hermann Hesse's use of Jungian psychoanalysis and Eastern mysticism in The Glass Bead Game results in a combination similar to the later genre of magic realism. Although the 15 years after the end of World War I saw hyperinflation and mass unemployment in Germany, it was also a time of a great flourishing in the arts and sciences, known as Weimar culture. Many leading intellectuals were Jewish, and the period came to an end with Hitler's ascent to power in 1933 and the rise in anti-Semitism, when thousands of Jews fled Germany. New forms for a new world. While the Weimar era lasted, German-language literary experimentalism was ambitious in its attempts to express the complexities of the modern world, and Berlin Alexanderplatz by Alfred Doblin was a key work. It is the story of a low-level pimp, Franz Biberkopf, who struggles to make his way in the criminal underclass after being released from prison. The characters speak in the almost untranslatable argot of the slums of interwar Berlin, and the novel is a dazzling exercise in literary montage. At times it takes the form of newspaper stories, street ballads, speeches, and extracts from fictional books. The narrative incorporates stream of consciousness and a mixture of first and third-person viewpoints. Through this complex experimental technique, 1920s Berlin itself is given vivid expression, leading Berlin Alexanderplatz to be seen as one of the great Großstadtroman, or big city novels, which focus on life in urban areas. German fellow citizens, never has a nation been betrayed more ignominiously and more unjustly than the German people. Berlin Alexanderplatz. See also, Metamorphosis, the Magic Mountain, the Man Without Qualities. In context. Focus. The Harlem Renaissance before. 1923 Jean Toomer publishes his first novel, Cain, a key modernist work evoking black life in the South. Of mixed race, Toomer preferred to be termed an American writer rather than a black writer, but was a central figure in the Harlem Renaissance. 1923 Aged 21, Count T. Cullen wins an award from the Poetry Society of America for his poem The Ballad of the Brown Girl, about a doomed interracial romance. He becomes a key figure in the Harlem Renaissance. 1934 Harlem Renaissance writer Langston Hughes publishes his first short story collection, The Ways of White Folks, focusing on race relations. The title is intended to be mocking the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s and single quote 30s, or the flowering of Negro literature, as the U.S. author and civil rights activist James Weldon Johnson put it, was an important awakening of African American cultural pride and identity. The movement centered on Harlem, New York City, USA, and began in 1924 when Opportunity magazine held a party to introduce black writers to white publishers, giving them access to mainstream exposure. Emerging out of a burgeoning urban black middle class, the Harlem Renaissance also embraced theater, music, and a new political awareness. Although the Great Depression brought the movement to an end, it marked a significant step forward in self-respect for Black America, and laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement after World War II. A defiant voice. Zora Neale Hurston was a Harlem Renaissance writer and a prominent figure in both African American and women's literature. Her best-known novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, is about a poor black woman, Janie Crawford, in the southern states of the USA in the early 20th century. The story is bookended by her return to Eatonville, Florida. Thea's proud first all-black city, where Hurston herself grew up. Like other Harlem Renaissance texts, the novel differs from earlier works about African American life by being honest and realistic rather than overtly sentimental. Hurston's innovative use of the rural Southern Black dialect is a notable feature of the text. The book also focuses on Janie's marriages to 3 husbands, each of whom dominates her life and undermines her status, and against whom she rebels. Their Eyes Were Watching God is an early and defiant voice on several crucial issues that have lost none of their relevance or resonance in the modern world, notably racism, poverty, and gender inequality. See also, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, Invisible Man Beloved. In context. Focus. Hard-boiled fiction before. 1930 The Maltese Falcon, by U.S. author Dashiell Hammett, introduces the sleuth Sam Spade, whose strong ethical values were an inspiration for Chandler's Philip Marlowe. 1934 The Postman Always Rings Twice, by U.S. writer James M. Cain, gains notoriety for its sex and brutal violence. After 1943 Another novel by Cain, Double Indemnity, tackles the theme of a femme fatale plotting to kill her husband, in this case the motive being to claim on life insurance. 1953 in Chandler's The Long Goodbye, which has Marlowe as its hero, two characters, Roger Wade, a hard-drinking writer, and Terry Lennox, another alcoholic, are partly autobiographical. Hard-boiled detective fiction brought realism, sex, violence, and fast, colloquial dialogue to the crime genre. It began with the short story form, especially those stories published in the popular pulp magazines of the 1920s to 1940s, the leading exponent being Black Mask. Raymond Chandler's most illustrious predecessor was Dashiell Hammett, whose first hard-boiled detective story, Red Harvest, came out a decade before Chandler's The Big Sleep and was originally serialized in Black Mask. The hard-boiled detective, although clever, is a man of action. Battling organized crime and police corruption, he gets dragged into violence. Guns are among the hazards he faces, and in certain situations he needs to carry one, and sometimes use it. These experiences harden him into cynicism, hence the phrase hard-boiled. Yet at the same time, he has his principles. Chandler's detective, Philip Marlowe, ordering a young woman to get dressed in the Big Sleep after refusing her advances, looks down at his chessboard and sees that he has made a mistake with a knight move. Knights, he says, have no meaning in this game. But they do. Marlowe, for all his faults, is a modern knight, among the kings and queens of crime and their pawns. He is loyal to clients, hates liars, cheats, and thugs, and fights back with wit and courage. Two intertwined plots linked by sexual attraction provide The Big Sleep with its storyline, revolving around an elderly ex-general's two wayward daughters, missing persons, blackmail, murder, and double crosses. The result is a complex but well-controlled tale. New uses for pulp. Part of Chandler's achievement was to apply literary sophistication to pulp fiction subjects. The Big Sleep is told by Marlowe in the first person, and the language is sharply idiomatic, colloquial not only in the dialogue, but also the narration. But the prose has a jewel-like precision, with terse, beautifully crafted sentences. There are witty or amusingly exaggerated similes, such as doors which would have let in a troop of Indian elephants, but they are not overdone. The story has a tight plot, with one situation flowing naturally into the next. 2/3 of the way in, Marlowe has solved the mystery for his client. However, he spends the rest of the book tying up a loose end, and putting himself in further danger to discover how deep into evil and arch-villain has fallen. Throughout, Marlowe remains one step ahead of everybody else, and able, like the chess knight, to outwit his enemies by unexpected moves. The Big Sleep of the title is death, and is the subject of a poignant coda in which Marlowe, showing self-understanding far beyond Sherlock Holmes, implicates himself as part of the nastiness. Raymond Chandler. Born in Chicago, USA, in 1888, Raymond Chandler was taken to England at the age of 12 by his divorced mother. He was schooled at Dulwich College, South London, and later studied international law in France and Germany. Returning to the USA in 1912, he lived in California, working, among other jobs, as a tennis racket stringer. He joined the Canadian Army after World War I broke out, and served in France. In 1924 he married Cissy Pascal, a woman 18 years his senior. He started writing in earnest after losing his job at an oil company in the Great Depression. His first published story appeared in Black Mask magazine in 1933. The Big Sleep was his first novel. He went on to write 6 others. In 1959, the year before he died, he became president of the Mystery Writers of America. Other key works. 1940 Farewell, My Lovely. 1949 The Little Sister. 1953 The Long Goodbye. See also, Bleak House, The Moonstone, The Hound of the Baskervilles, The New York Trilogy. In context. Focus Writers in Exile. Before 1932 the Austrian Jewish writer Joseph Roth writes the Radetzky March, which details Austria-Hungary's decline, a year before he leaves Germany for Paris. He remains in exile for the rest of his life. 1939 Bertolt Brecht's anti-war play Mother Courage and Her Children is written a few years after he flees Nazi persecution. 1941 published just before his suicide in Brazilian exile, Austrian author Stefan Zweig's novella The Royal Game criticizes the brutality of the Third Reich's Nazi regime. After 1952 Holocaust survivor Paul Celan produces a collection of poems, Poppy and Memory, after settling in Paris following horrific wartime experiences in his native Central Europe. Many writers were forced to flee their homelands before and during World War II, and a somber, wistful, and elegiac tone is often evident in the literature produced in exile by such writers, who include Joseph Roth, Bertolt Brecht, Stefan Zweig, and Paul Celan. Also among this exodus was Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who wrote The Little Prince in New York after he had left France, following its occupation by the Nazis. Like many of the great literary works from this era, The Little Prince is not strictly a war novel, but it is shaped by the political and social context that the war brought about. Saint-Exupéry's book has been read in numerous ways, as a general moral and philosophical fable, as a children's fairy tale, as an autobiographical story that has been reimagined as fantasy, and as a direct reflection of its times. These interpretations have all been made of other works of exile literature, which commonly lament a lost way of life. Here is my secret. Very simply, you can only see things clearly with your heart. What is essential is invisible to the eye. The Little Prince. State of dislocation. Given its genesis in a time of displacement, it is not surprising that the title character of Saint-Exupéry's novel is an alien boy who falls to earth in the eerie landscape of the Sahara Desert. The narrator, a pilot who has crash-landed, encounters the boy there. Abandonment, wandering, escape, and instability characterize the narrative of The Little Prince, which presents us with a seemingly simple children's story. But like all good examples of such fiction, it is a tale for both old and young. Saint-Exupéry takes from classic children's literature the idea that the state of childhood is one of transition, where difference predominates. The prince is literally and metaphorically an alien wandering the earth, a child lost in an adult world. But as a character, his alienness is infused with a moral philosophy that celebrates dissimilarity and questions the world of adults, which has led to war, and, in Saint-Exupéry's case, exile from home. Like a child's painful maturation into the unknowable realm of adulthood, the state of exile is a process of losing and relearning one's place in the world. Tolerating difference. This strangeness of the adult world, coupled with the novel's celebration of the Little Prince's alienness, has also been read as a political critique. The baobab trees, which infest the home planet of the Little Prince, have been interpreted as a reference to the contemporary sickness of Nazism and its equally grasping nature as it moved across Europe, destroying all in its path, including Saint-Exupéry's beloved France. The narrator warns about some terrible seeds on the Little Prince's planet. And a baobab, if you tackle it too late, will bore right through a planet with its roots. In contrast, the novel positions the humanist philosophy of rationality, compassion, and respect for difference against this spreading disaster. The alien boy advises us all that eyes are blind. One must look with the heart. The Little Prince is a timeless yet timely exploration of the value of human life. Like other writers in exile, Saint-Exupéry explores loss and change against a backdrop of upheaval and alienation, which fosters kindness towards others and a toleration of difference. The rise of the Nazis saw the emergence of writer refugees whose homelands became hostile environments due to politics, anti-Semitism, and war. Antoine Delaware Saint-Exupéry. Born to a French aristocratic family in 1900, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry had a strict upbringing in a chateau near Lyon. During his national service, he became an aviator. Before World War II, He was a commercial pilot who pioneered airmail routes in Europe, South America, and Africa. When war broke out, he joined the French Air Force and flew reconnaissance missions until 1940. During these years he produced many well-known works, but The Little Prince was not written until he and his wife, Consuelo Suncine, fled heartbroken into exile after France's defeat and its armistice with Germany. Vilified by his government and depressed by his stormy marriage, Saint-Exupéry flew his last flight in 1944, over the Mediterranean, where it is believed he was shot down. His posthumous reputation has recovered him as one of France's literary heroes. Other key works: 1926 The Aviator, 1931 Night Flight, 1944 Letter to a Hostage. See also, Mother Courage and Her Children, Poppy and Memory, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Further reading: The Call of the Wild. Jack London. The masterpiece of the U.S. writer London, The Call of the Wild, a popular and unashamedly emotional tale of survival, is set during the 1890s Klondike Gold Rush in Alaska. The main character is a dog, half Saint Bernard, half Collie, purloined from a California ranch and set to work as a sled dog in faraway Alaska. He suffers abuse by his owners and aggression from a rival dog before finally turning feral. Shedding civilization and relearning primitive ways, he becomes leader of a wolf pack. They were savages, all of them, who knew no law but the law of club and fang. The Call of the Wild, Jack London. Nostromo. Joseph Conrad. Poland-born novelist Conrad, a mariner for 20 years, took British citizenship in 1886 and wrote in English. Nostromo, subtitled A Tale of the Seaboard, is an analysis of politics, revolution, and corruption that plays out in a fictional Republic of South America, and an important examination of post-colonial global capitalism. Fused with these themes is a tale of adventure that traces the fortunes of the eponymous hero, a man of principle. This is a dark work, full of betrayal and disillusion. Much of the story, even the climax, is conveyed by flashbacks. Ethan Frome. Edith Wharton. The most popular work of U.S. author Wharton, Ethan Frome, is narrated by a visitor to a New England town who is intrigued by one of its residents, Ethan Frome, a dour and monosyllabic farmer. Switching from the first person to an extended third-person flashback, the novel tells the tragic tale of the secret love of Frome for his wife's cousin, and the tragic outcome of a snowy smash-up that occurred 24 years earlier. The themes of passion, thwarted emotions, resentment, and frustration are magnified against the harsh rustic environment. Death in Venice. Thomas Mann. The most famous novella by German Nobel laureate Mann, Death in Venice, is about a famous author suffering from writer's block, who takes a short holiday in the Italian city of the title, where he becomes obsessed by a 14-year-old boy. Cholera has been detected and there are health warnings in place, creating an atmosphere of dissolution. The book is a Freudian reflection on both the degenerative force of illicit homoerotic passion across the generations, and of the profound poignancy of aging. Sons and Lovers. D.H. Lawrence. A partly autobiographical exploration of the working-class family and romantic relationships, Sons and Lovers is often seen as Lawrence's finest work. Set in the mining region where Lawrence was brought up, the book tells the story of a young budding artist, Paul Morell, who has romantic involvements with an unyielding, religiously minded girlfriend and a married woman, both of whom are overshadowed by Paul's mother, with whom he shares a close, suffocating bond. Paul's father is violent and uneducated, which adds to family tensions. The book is an unsentimental portrait of childhood, adolescence, the clash between generations, and familial possessiveness and grief, set within a closely observed social setting. The mother's unfulfilled life and final fatal illness are poignantly depicted. D.H. Lawrence. Born in 1885, David Herbert Lawrence was the son of a coal miner and the first from his village in Nottinghamshire, England, to win a scholarship to the local high school. His early promise led to university and a teaching career, but his writing talent, his first story was published in 1907, persuaded him to quit teaching in 1912. He eloped to Germany with married aristocrat Frieda Weekly in the same year. Marked by a spontaneous, vivid realism, Lawrence's writing subverted prevailing social, sexual, and cultural norms, earning him censorship and, at the time of his death in 1930, a tarnished reputation. Key works: 1913 Sons and Lovers, 1915 The Rainbow, 1920 Women in Love, In Search of Lost Time. Marcel Proust. Published in 7 volumes over 15 years, In Search of Lost Time, or Remembrance of Things Past, is a masterpiece of French writer Marcel Proust. In a famous early scene, The Taste of a Madeleine Cake releases memories of boyhood holidays for the first-person narrator. Proust's leisurely, analytical prose outlines detailed accounts of the inner lives of both himself and the characters of the work, including love and jealousy, homosexuality, artistic ambition, and many varieties of vice and virtue. The experience of living in wartime Paris is vividly conveyed. Throughout, social nuances are subtly registered. Eventually the narrator learns that the beauty of the past lives on in the memory, time is regained. He then sets about writing his life's story. This autobiographical dimension is one of the work's many fascinations. A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. James Joyce. The first novel by Irish writer Joyce, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, traces the early years of a character who would later reappear in Joyce's 1922 masterpiece, Ulysses. Stephen Dedalus rebels against the norms of Ireland and Catholicism, and sets out to forge his own destiny, as a writer in Paris. The book uses stream of consciousness narrative in a way that foreshadows the author's later work. The Heartless. Yi Kwang-soo. A South Korean journalist and independence activist, Yi Kwang-soo was the author of the first modern Korean novel, The Heartless. It tells the story of a young teacher of English and Seoul, torn between 2 women in the period of Japanese occupation. One is traditionalist and working as a kissang, the other is inclined to liberated Western values. The protagonist's predicament is used to dramatize social tensions in Korea, but the book also explores personal, sexual awakening as well as cultural ambiguities. Siddhartha. Hermann Hesse. Hugely popular in the 1960s due to its exploration of Eastern spirituality, Siddhartha by Swiss writer Hesse describes the spiritual life of a young Brahmin in ancient India. The title is Sanskrit, meaning he who has attained his goals. The hero opts not to join the order newly created by the Buddha, but to discover his own form of insight. Sidetracked by wealth and erotic desire, he finally gains wisdom and love in the consciousness of the world's unimprovable completeness. The book fuses spiritual thinking with psychoanalysis and philosophy. A Passage to India. E. M. Forster. English author E. M. Forster sets A Passage to India during the period of the British Raj in India, amid the stirrings of the movement for independence. The book's central event is an alleged and unspecified attempt at sexual impropriety in a cave complex, by a young Muslim Indian doctor against a British woman with whom he is on friendly terms. The case against the doctor, which leads to a trial, brings to the surface tensions between colonized and colonizing nations. Forster questions the underlying principles of British imperialism, in the process puncturing the romantic delusions of those seduced by the image of the British Raj. He also shows the marginalization of women in a milieu where male friendships are strong and mutually supportive. In England the moon had seemed dead and alien. Here she was caught in the shawl of night together with Earth and all the other stars. A Passage to India. E. M. Forster. The Trial. Franz Kafka. Written in 1914-15, The Trial is the most complete of 3 unfinished novels by Jewish Czech writer Franz Kafka, who wrote in German. Its account of Joseph K., arrested and prosecuted by an inscrutable authority without being told the nature of his crime, has been interpreted as an archetypal metaphor for modern alienation, and for the dehumanizing effect of elaborate, inflexible bureaucracies, and, by extension, of totalitarian states. The latter interpretation makes Kafka a prescient author, anticipating fascism and Nazism. Someone must have been telling lies about Joseph K., for without having done anything wrong he was arrested one fine morning. The Trial Franz Kafka. Mrs. Dalloway. Virginia Woolf. Mrs. Dalloway, written by Woolf when she was at the height of her powers, lays bare the consciousness of a well-to-do woman spending a day in London. Clarissa Dalloway's thoughts turn to a party she will be hosting that evening, but also range back in time, to her youth and the experience of her marriage to a reliable but unsatisfying man. The other major character is a traumatized soldier who spends time in the park with his Italian wife, before making a tragic decision. Technically the novel is accomplished and original, shifting between direct and indirect speech, and juggling between omniscient narration, stream of consciousness, and soliloquy. Virginia Woolf. Foremost of the writers in the Bloomsbury set of influential intellectuals and artists, Woolf was born in 1882 in London. She started writing as a girl and her first novel, The Voyage Out, appeared in 1915. She married, happily, in 1912, but is also known for her love affair with talented gardener Vitus Sackville West. Woolf soon established herself as a leading intellectual and writer, taking fiction in a new direction, inwards. But she was prone to depression and mood swings. She committed suicide by drowning near Lewes, Sussex, in 1941, aged 59. Many feminist thinkers since her death have revered her as an inspiration. Key works: 1925 Mrs. Dalloway, 1927 To the Lighthouse, 1931 The Waves. The Counterfeiters. André Gide. Seen as a precursor to the 1950s Nouveau Roman novel form, The Counterfeiters by French author Gide draws a parallel between counterfeit gold coins and the authenticity of human feelings and relationships. Structured as a story within a story, the book is complicated by multiple plotlines and viewpoints in an attempt at a literary form of cubism, an art style in which the concept of a single point of perspective was abandoned. Centered around young men in fin de siècle Paris, one of the themes is the possibilities for fulfillment within homosexual relationships. Doña Barbara. Romulo Gallegos. Romulo Gallegos wrote Doña Barbara 2 decades before becoming the first democratically elected president of his native Venezuela. The novel, named after its charismatic female character, who exerts mysterious power over men, examines the tension between primitive and civilized impulses, and between the sexes. Set in the rural cattle ranching Llanos Prairie region, the story is told using evocative, vernacular language. There are magical realist elements that anticipate the fiction of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. The Sound and the Fury. William Faulkner. An ambitious and enigmatic novel comprising 4 counterpointed perspectives, The Sound and the Fury is a masterpiece by Nobel laureate Faulkner, arch-chronicler of the U.S. South. The setting is Jefferson, Mississippi. The first section is a disjointed narrative told by Benji, a 33-year-old, cognitively disabled man. The second section is narrated by his older brother, a suicidal Harvard student 18 years earlier. The third, by Benji's hard-nosed younger brother. And the last section is narrated by one of the family's female black servants. Using stream of consciousness and radical time shifts, Faulkner creates a complex jigsaw of imagination and insight, and writes with an unparalleled understanding of race, grief, family dysfunction, and the decay of old Southern values. William Faulkner. An American Nobel Prize winner, Faulkner chronicled the South of his country. He was born in 1897, in New Albany, Mississippi. In 1902 his family moved to Oxford, Mississippi, where his father was business manager of the university. This was where Faulkner would spend most of his life, and the surrounding Lafayette County was the inspiration for his fictional Yoknapatawpha County, the setting for most of his novels. He first wrote poetry, and it was not until 1925 that he tackled a novel. He also trained in Canada as a pilot in the Royal Air Force. Faulkner's books often depict the decline of the upper echelons of society, addressing controversial themes such as slavery. But he also wrote about the poorer classes. He died in 1962, aged 64. Key works: 1929 The Sound and the Fury, 1930 As I Lay Dying, 1931 These 13, 1936 Absalom, Absalom. The Man Without Qualities. Robert Musil. Unfinished and written in 3 volumes, The Man Without Qualities was the life's work and masterpiece of Austrian novelist Musil. Eschewing plot-driven momentum, Musil presents a complex social vision and exposes modern values and political folly. Set in the twilight of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is satirized with heavy irony, the rambling story encompasses many characters in its more than 1,000 pages: a black page, an aristocrat, the murderer of a prostitute, and a hero who serves as a detached commentator on a collapsing society. Brave New World. Aldous Huxley. English writer Aldous Huxley's presence in Brave New World, whose ironic title comes from a line in Shakespeare's The Tempest, a vision of a dystopian future, set in London around the year 2540. A world totalitarian state represses individual freedom and self-expression, including emotions. Genetic engineering and brainwashing are used as tools of control, and recreational drugs and sex are freely available. Consumerism is rampant, while spiritual values have shriveled to nothing. Even the terms mother and father are outlawed. A rebellious spirit, John the Savage, sets himself against the system and does battle with the world controllers. The book is admired for its prophetic insights as well as its moral outlook and vivid writing. Journey to the End of the Night. Louis Ferdinand Céline. Radically experimental in style and treatment, Journey to the End of the Night is a partly autobiographical novel by French writer Dr. Louis Ferdinand Auguste Stutches, who wrote under the pseudonym Céline, which was also his grandmother's first name. Characterized by black comedic invective, the mood is darkly pessimistic, even misanthropic. The story traces the protagonist Ferdinand Bardini's journeys from France at the start of World War I, via colonial Africa to the USA and back to Paris. Focusing on human stupidity, Céline has challenging things to say about war, empire, and the ruling classes. Tropic of Cancer. Henry Miller. Banned by censors for its explicit and deliberately shocking sexual content, Tropic of Cancer was the debut novel of U.S. writer Miller. A sprawling, plotless, semi-autobiographical masterpiece, it describes life and love at the extremes of existence in 1930s Paris. Publication in the USA and UK was delayed until censorship laws were overturned in the 1960s. The book inspired a new wave of writers, such as the US Beat Generation. The Book of Disquiet. Fernando Pessoa. Described by Portuguese author Pessoa as a factless autobiography, The Book of Disquiet was only published 47 years after his death. A modernist masterpiece, it is a fluid, kaleidoscopic, and unfinished mosaic of fragments that combine glimpses of self-revelation with reveries and maxims of literary criticism and philosophy. Pessoa filtered his writing through the use of heteronyms, invented authorial personae, and this highly original book gives a spellbinding insight into the process. Although a study in loneliness and despair, the story has a brilliant inventiveness that makes it engaging. Of Mice and Men. John Steinbeck. Steinbeck's most popular book and widely praised at the time of its publication, Of Mice and Men, is set in 1930s California during the Great Depression. It follows two itinerant ranch workers whose dream is to have a small farm of their own. An incident involving a ranch owner's daughter propels the story into tragedy. Steinbeck's themes include the hardship of penury,